From the ages of 12 to 15, I was able to participate in 4 different short-term mission trips in Maracaibo, Venezuela. Our church took a crew down there to do a number of different things, some recreational, VBS type stuff, some food stuff. We did some construction stuff, and these trips left a real mark on me personally. They were incredibly formative and shaped me significantly as a teenager and as a young believer. I remember part of the first trip that we went on, we were tasked with at least helping to build a well in a community that was actually right outside the city of Maracaibo. Maracaibo is a bustling city. People were everywhere. The traffic laws were actually much more like traffic suggestions. It was pretty wild to drive around in Maracaibo. But what it did do is it made for quite the dichotomy of scenery as we left Maracaibo and went into this community. The paved roads that we were on quickly became dirt roads. These large concrete structures and buildings soon became like metal shacks and lean-tos. And these large electrical poles that carried electricity throughout the city actually became large branches of trees that had been pulled down and stuck vertically so the same cables could run along the roads. I remember as we were making our way out of the town, the further we got away from the city, the closer we got to the city dump. And the reason for that was because the city dump was where we were going. This community was positioned right outside the local landfill. It's called Paraguason. And in this community, there were men and women and boys and girls made in the image of God that were living off the scraps of the landfill. The things that they would find would be used for housing, for clothes, and for food. I remember looking out the window as we were riding on our bus out to this community and seeing like these small kind of holes in the ground outside what these people were living in. I looked at one of the guys that was on the team and said, "Hey, what are these holes? Like what is this for?" And I'll never forget his answer. That's where the older children sleep. Memories of this trip come flooding my mind as I consider the verse here in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 2, which says this: "And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor.'" Now you might be thinking, what? Like, what's the connection here? Like, that's odd. This doesn't even make sense. What are you talking about? Well, bear with me. There's a couple things worth highlighting here. Number one, the author of Ruth is actually really set on making sure that you and I, as the reader, understand that Ruth is not an Israelite. She's not a part of God's chosen nation. 8 different times in these 4 chapters, we are told that Ruth is a Moabite. She's a foreigner. She's an outsider. She even calls herself this in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 10. But the second thing worth highlighting is that while it is true that Ruth was a Moabite and not an Israelite, she was not yet a part of God's chosen people. That didn't mean that God didn't care about her. You see, what she's doing here in this verse, gleaning from the fields, is actually a provision that God had made in the law, that foreigners and sojourners, orphans and widows, they were permitted to come along the borders and the corners of the fields and gather the scraps. In this small act, God is demonstrating his own heart of care and compassion and kindness towards Ruth and those that we would consider the least of these. Similar to the heart of Jesus that he shares in Matthew 25 when he says that it's actually a responsibility of those that call him Lord to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to provide water for the thirsty, to welcome the stranger, to visit the sick and in prison, to care for the needy, to be compassionate towards those with less than us, to be kind and caring towards any person made in the image of God. How do you care for the poor, the marginalized, and the foreigner? Now I know this very quickly can become a political conversation, and that's Don't worry. That's not where I'm headed. I think what's a better focus of our attention is not necessarily the policies of the land, but the posture of our hearts. Take a second and reflect on your own heart as it relates to the poor, the unfortunate, those that are struggling in multiple areas, the homeless, the needy. What is it that we do to show the love of God to these individuals? Do we justify inactivity because of some sort of excuse? Do we lack motive? Do we lack movement? Do we lack obedience because we're afraid that something might get abused? Hear me out. Act wisely. But the mind of wisdom should always be guided by a heart of love. And in this small verse, we see the love of God, and that those that were outside of his people, he still cared for, provided for, made provision for, made sure that they were watched over, that he loved them deeply. Reflecting on God's own heart of love should compel us to then demonstrate that same love. The love that's been shown to us, we should then show to others, to the needy, to the poor, to the marginalized, to the foreigner, in our schools, in our communities, and around the world, for the name and renown of Jesus.